Good evening, everybody. Good evening. Welcome here. Uh, in case you're wondering, I'm not Ed Glaeser. My name is Dieter von Fintel. I'm the Vice Dean for Research in the Faculty of Economic and Management Sciences, and I would like to welcome you very warmly to this very wonderful event. I welcome you to the biennial Visser Memorial Lecture, taking place especially in the Economic and Management Sciences centenary year. So it's a very special time for us. And I'd just like to say that all protocols are observed and for everybody to feel welcome here. Thank you. We commemorate the legacy of the late Visser, who was a dynamic business leader in South Africa. He was the CEO of Remgro, an alumnus of our faculty, and also a strong supporter of Stellenbosch University. Following his untimely passing in 2012, the faculty decided to honor his memory with a biennial lecture series inviting leading international scholars, and that's what we're here for today. We're very grateful to Remgro, who are represented here by quite a number of people today, for sponsoring this event and for their continued support of our faculty. We also gratefully acknowledge Amanda Visser and her family for their continued association with our faculty. They have made apologies this evening and unfortunately cannot join us this evening. In 2025, we mark 100 years of teaching and research excellence in the Economic and Management Sciences faculty at Stellenbosch. Our theme for this year is transforming the economy and society. This vision will be front and center at various alumni events and on-campus events throughout 2025. Our faculty has produced leaders in the corporate sector, thought leaders in academia, and influential graduates who lead the public discourse. We are proud of what many who have come before us have achieved. But we also acknowledge that we need to adapt, transform, and actively change to face rapid technological change, climate change, fiscal constraints, and to address deeply entrenched challenges related to poverty, inequality, and social incohesion in South Africa. One such rapid change is urbanisation, and that's what we're here for today. In the 1970s, only about 20% of South Africans lived in urban areas. Hard to believe. Today, more than 40% of all people live only in our 8 largest cities. So Cape Town and the 3 metropoles in Gauteng and a few other metropolitan areas. And these places account for more than 60% of our economic output, which shows us how important cities are in South Africa. The transformation to urbanization has been relatively rapid in South Africa, to the degree that our cities are buckling under the pressure to deliver services to households and businesses. And those of you who read Friday's Business Day would have seen the front page lamenting the finances and the infrastructure of our cities. But despite these challenges, people continue to flock to cities because they are a hub of opportunity. And this is what the talk will be about today. We have no better expert to talk to these exciting but daunting transitions than Professor Ed Glaeser. He's one of the world's foremost urban economists and a leading voice on the dynamics of cities. He's the Fred and Eleanor Glimp Professor of Economics at Harvard University in the United States, where he has spent many years researching the forces that shape urban growth, housing markets, and innovation. He heads up the cities program of the International Growth Center, an influential research organization that supports policymakers to pursue sustainable growth, especially in the Global South. He's the recipient of the prestigious Hirschman Prize in Economics and is one of the most widely cited researchers in our discipline. So we are very privileged to hear from him today. Professor Glaeser is widely known for his influential book, Triumph of the City, which argues that cities are humanity's greatest invention and central to solving many of our most pressing challenges in the current day. His work has profoundly shaped how policymakers, scholars, and practitioners think about urbanization, especially in the Global South. Please join me in welcoming Professor Ed Glaeser to address us about transforming Africa's cities. Thank you very much, Ed.
Thank you, Peter. It's wonderful to be here. Let's see if I need the mic or not. But it's wonderful to be here. This is actually my first trip to South Africa since before COVID. and it's fantastic to be back. About 10 years ago, I decided that by far the most interesting and important things that were happening in cities were happening in the Global South, and that, the most interesting things that were happening in the Global South were happening in cities. And so I decided that I wanted to redirect my attention towards cities like Cape Town or Johannesburg. Unfortunately, 5 years ago, a certain number of global disruptions happened, most notably COVID, which made it very difficult to travel. And so anything that I'm going to show you today that involves field work in the developing world began before 2020. Then there was this, the matter of American cities having their own sort of problems again, which seemed important. And then a deep personal tragedy that, I know some people share with me occurred to me, which is I became department chair. And I am recovering from that. So these things happen to us all. Okay. So as we know, Africa is a place of, at this point in time, rapid urbanization. We're moving towards a world in which Africa will be an overwhelmingly urban continent, like all of the others. And by and large, that's a process that I see as benign, but as Dieter very much highlighted, also fraught. Right? Because, in some sense, an abundance of space hides many sins, and the failures of the public sector become both visible and often amplified when we live close to one another. One way to see the change that occurred between 1960 and 2010 is with this graph. And so I'm grouping countries by income bars. I'm, of course, correcting for inflation. And what you can see is that if you look at countries with per capita incomes between 3,000 and 4,000, or 4,000 and 5,000, almost all of these countries, 80% or more, were more than one-third urban in 1960 and were more than one-third urban in 2010. So relatively little change. If you go, however, to the poorest countries, those countries with per capita income below $1,000, what share of those countries were more than one-third urban in 1960? A really easy number to remember, 0, not a 1. Because to be poor was to be overwhelmingly rural, and this had been true throughout all of human history, right? Today, in 2010, actually, the share is higher now. More than 40% of the world's poorest countries were more than one-third urban, right? If you look at the 1 to 2,000 category, there's also a dramatic transition from about 20% to almost 60%. And you see the rise of cities like Kinshasa and Karachi in places that are both poor and often poorly governed, right? And it reminds us of the enormous challenges that we have ahead of ourselves. The talk that's going to follow is going to have a number of sort of starting observations on cities. We're then going to transition to a lengthy riff on segregation. Okay, I've worked on segregation in the U.S. since the 1990s, and it seemed like a relevant topic for South Africa as well. And so, but the theme of that whole section is that the essential function of urban density is enabling us to connect with one another, right? Enabling us to buy, to sell, to learn, to work together, right? What segregation ends up doing is it breaks those connections for at least some share of the population. And that's why I see sort of segregation as being, in some sense, the opposite of urbanity in many ways. And then, we're going to switch to infrastructure in urban areas, which is both related to segregation, but also related more generally to the functioning of cities. Before doing that, I just want to sort of add 3 observations on city government more generally, which has come out of sort of every time I interact with Cape Town government, something like this emerges. And I'm not going to defend this, I'm just going to throw out these 3 things. One of which is a regular mantra of mine, that the right recipe for economic development strategy is to attract and train smart people and then get out of their way. I want to highlight that strategy is not one that is involved in laissez-faire. Right? Attracting and training smart people is, in fact, very hard to do properly. And often, quality of life strategy is economic development strategy. Second observation, governments need to decide what they need to do. Right? And one of the biggest mistakes that city governments often do is to do too much in one area, like, regulate the production of housing or regulate the uses of particular neighborhoods and make sure you can't have any businesses enmeshed in residential areas, and not do the things which are absolutely vital, like managing public spaces to keep them safe and relatively functional. And so choosing what the right scope of government is absolutely central. And the third observation, and this is an observation I've now repeated in hundreds of other places, but it was 100% motivated by Cape Town. Okay, which is, it is often helpful for a city which has any of the attributes of Cape Town to see themselves as basically having 2 layers. A lower layer, which is a for-profit real estate development company, that is entirely owned by a not-for-profit poverty alleviation company. And the reason why that is a helpful lens is you really don't want to screw up the thing that actually makes you money downtown because you think you're going to use that to alleviate poverty. You really want to make sure that you're keeping the sort of like the thing which pays the bills going, right? Without, even though we recognize at the end of the day, the reason you need the bills paid is to actually lift up the poorest and most vulnerable citizens. And so it sort of is a framework for thinking about things, which is it's a very econ framework. But I think it's helpful, and I'm good at that. And that's sort of just my high level sort of governance stuff. Okay, let's get going. Okay, so this is the general observations about cities. I find it deeply ironic that, in fact, one of the most famous critics of urbanism in the 20th century is Gandhi, right? I find this ironic for many reasons, one of which, of course, is that in his own life, the cities of South Africa were such a university for him, right? There was such an opportunity for him to learn his trade, to learn how he transformed the world. This came out of cities. It didn't come from him sitting in, he went to rural villages and spun later, but, this is Gandhi learning, right? This is Gandhi as a great man later on telling the world what he's learned, right? And in some sense, it sort of moves against this study. Now, I find it also ironic because of the sort of tremendous correlation between urbanization and subsequent economic growth. So this is among the poorest countries in the world, countries with below $5,000 per capita income in 1960. This is the relationship between urbanization and growth. Now, no part of this should mean that I suggest that this is all causal or that, in fact, we should be forcing people to move for cities. That would be madness. But I look at this and I think, how in the world can you look at a graph like this and say, what I really want to do is stop people from urbanizing, right? I really want to, and now just my third fact is this is the gap between rural and urban happiness as reported to the World Value Survey, right? It's a little bit outdated, this data, I should actually update it. But you notice that there's no real difference in the rich countries of the world. Some of them, like New Zealand, they're happier in rural areas. Some of them, like Sweden, they're happier in urban areas. Like, I can't imagine rural Sweden in January. So, I'm not surprised that there's a certain amount of misery there. But if you go to the poorest countries in the world, and South Africa, which is not that poor relative to these poor areas, like, there's a huge urban happiness gap. I mean, the people living in cities are just much more satisfied with their lives than the people living in rural areas. And like, irony of ironies, what's the global leader in gap between urban rural happiness and rural happiness? It's India. Okay, so like it's not just that there's a huge income gap in all these countries. There's also a life satisfaction gap as well. There are a couple of places which are going the other way. So Iraq and Thailand. Now, notice this is 2007, and so Iraq was experiencing certain negative exogenous shocks to its cities, which may have something to do with that. And then, of course, this is Thailand. I'm blaming this on Bangkok's traffic jams, but I don't have a better explanation. Okay, so that's my general observations, and certainly it is a view that if we see places that are underperforming, right, we want to try and fix them. We don't want to look at it and say, why can't we just stop people from coming to these areas? Which is why I have the view that sort of making the cities of the global south more functional, more humane, better places of opportunity is one of the great vocations of the 21st century. Okay, so this is from a tour I did in Dunoon in 2019. This is my own photograph. The question is, do places like Dunoon, do the townships provide pathways out of poverty into prosperity? Now, it turns out we know much less about this than we should, okay? Because we have sort of two types of evidence typically. We have, this is, from Mark Stoker and Suri's paper in the Journal of Economic Perspectives in 2013. They look at Kibera and they just ask people how many years have you been in Kibera? And they document that, the people who have been in Kibera longer, right, they're not doing any better. Okay, they're not, but of course, there's a problem with this data-wise, which is it's a cross-section, and presumably the people who were successful in Kibera got out of Kibera, right? And so this is a much harder thing to see. Now, a slightly more plausible piece of evidence. So this is Janice Perlman's work. This is from her book Favela, which was written in 2010. So this is looking at the original residents of a Brazilian slum in 1916, and then she follows them later. She follows them 32 years later. And that's one of enormous improvement. So in 1969, 43% had a brick home, 54% had indoor plumbing, 73% had electricity, 72% were illiterate. By 2001, all of these things look vastly better, right? 32 years later, just a huge difference, and their children and grandchildren are doing much better. Now, the problem with this data, of course, is there's no control sample. So this is just a country which got much richer over this time period, and we're not. So what you're looking for is something that's a reasonable panel of people, so you can look at people who come to cities. And what I'm going to be working with is I'm going to be using the methods which are based closely on what Gilles Duranton and De La Roca did in their 2016 Review of Economic Studies paper by learning and working in big cities, which follows up about 35 years ago. To my knowledge, I pioneered the working of trying to estimate place effects by looking at migrants going in and out of it and looking at whether or not people see their wages going up. And the fact that came out of my paper, which was published in 2001 called Learning in Cities, is that people who come to big cities don't experience huge wage improvement in the US, but they experience faster wage growth year by year, month by month, which is compatible with the view that cities are forges of human capital, places that we get smart by being enmeshed in a maelstrom of economic activity. So they have institutional data, income tax data, for Spain, and they're actually able to estimate the treatment effect of different cities by looking at people over time. So all of this is controlling for an individual fixed effect, meaning we're sort of comparing people before and after they move to these cities, and so you're able to experience what happens, and this sort of shows sort of what they estimate, where you estimate allowing learning in cities, and so Madrid has a steeper growth plan than Seville. Now, I'm going to do this in what I think is pretty much the poorest country where you can trust the institutional data. And I'm not sure that one could do this in South Africa because I don't think you have anywhere near the level of institutional data where you could trust anything. So Brazil, among older Brazilians, the coverage is too low. Among younger Brazilians, 80% end up being in the formal sector. And we can look using the so-called race data, RAIS, across Brazil's metropolitan areas, across the whole city, and we can estimate different effects. Now, before showing you that, there are two data sets. This is a large national one, and this is just involves 6 large cities, so it's slightly more problematic. But this data set involves formal and informal workers. What I can't do is get rid of individual fixed effects with this because it's just a cross-section. So it is the same problem as the Canberra slum data. But I can look at whether or not formal and informal workers have different slopes of earnings experience gaps when they are formal versus informal. So I'm asking what age times log of population says is the impact of the bigger city, does it grow over time? So if it's positive, it's showing the fact that when you live in a city, your wages are going up by more and more over time. That's what this says. And what the first thing shows is, in fact, the formal group actually has a lower slope than the informal group, than the group as a whole, which means that the informal group has a slightly higher slope. And so this suggests that there's not something that's unusual about the formal workers, that the formal workers experience faster wage growth in the cities than the informal workers. This is less apparent in this data set, which is much smaller for cross-city coverage, but it doesn't look hugely different between formal and informal workers either. So it sort of seems relatively compatible with one another. So in at least the data sets where we have formal and informal workers, they look like they have the same age earning slopes in cities and outside them. And with that, that's all that I'm going to give you on the problem of selection into the formal sector in Brazil, and we'll go on. So this uses exactly the De La Roca and Puga methodology down to like exactly the regressions. And so we're estimating, as they do, the impact of city size both on the initial city premium and the medium-term premium. So this is allowing all these slopes to be different by city, and then you estimate this treatment effect of being longer in the city. And this shows you that the city size is bigger, has a bigger effect at medium term than the initial term. But because this data set is so large, I don't need to look at everybody. I can just look at initially poor people. And so that's what we're sort of doing that's different. We're asking whether or not there are city effects for the poor that are unusual, or at least that are present. And as we do this, we are controlling for these individual fixed effects. So we're controlling for your sort of average wage over the whole area. And what you can see here is there's a larger effect for all males, but there's an even bigger gap if you look at the initially poor males. So the cities seem to be particularly good for the initially poor people in Brazil. But what came out of this that blew me away was the difference between the North and the South. Okay, so it certainly does look like cities as a whole are places of upward mobility. This is just the initial premium. It would be the same thing if I looked at the median premium. So the northern cities are the blue ones, the southern cities are the red ones. The southern cities in Brazil feel much more European. The northern cities feel more segregated, and they feel like a different world in lots of ways. And so you can see if I just control for city size, the northern Brazilian cities are just right below the southern Brazilian cities, right? There's a huge gap in terms of the city premium. But if I measure something which is the segregation at the firm level of low and high skilled workers. So this looks across firms, and we've normally measured segregation at the residence level, but this is actually using the tremendous strength of the race data that I know everybody who works for every formal firm. And so I calculate at the firm level a segregation index. And when you do that, you essentially explain the north-south difference. And so this at least supports the hypothesis that what's different between the northern Brazilian cities and the southern ones is the northern ones have complex firms that are larger, right? And typically have less skilled and more skilled people together in the south. Whereas in the northern Brazilian cities, they do largely resource extraction industries where the less skilled people work with other less skilled people. And at least it begs the hypothesis that actually we've been measuring, and I'll show you a little bit of this work, residential segregation for 70 years. But it may well be that for most people, the important segregation is what actually happens in the workplace, is actually who you're exposed to on the job. Because I can do more with the US, although I think the context is intrinsically less interesting, this is work on residential segregation, on workplace segregation across American firms, and this is joint with Bill Kerr and Frankie Dillon. It's actually been going up, so this is a standard dissimilarity index. Typically, this measures either the share of white or non-white or skilled or unskilled workers who would need to move across firms who get an even distribution of skills. So this means if you move 55% of the population across firms, you can actually get an even distribution. And so it's gone up. Residential skill, the workplace segregation has gone up over time. And this just compares for non-college workers, if you're in a high-skill establishment firm versus a low-skill establishment firm, what's your growth rate of your wages over the next 20 years? And so in every industry, it's better to have skilled coworkers, okay, in terms of your subsequent growth. I thought it was interesting which ones had the most of a gap. So the healthcare practitioner and technical was pretty big. Apparently protective services was also pretty big. That means like bodyguards. That's like rent-a-cop. And apparently it's really good if you have skilled people around you in your rent-a-cop organization. But you know, this is the range. And then we were able to use a whole bunch of what we thought of as sort of experiments that occurred. So like you're working for a company and some other company gets moved in en masse into your firm. So there's a large relocation of people from one establishment to another. That creates two experiments, one of which is the large-scale move impacts the stayers, impacts the people who are being impacted, and it also impacts the movers, okay? And so all of these all sort of show the difference between you get a positive shock to your skill level versus your negative shock, and this is both the movers and the stayers are here. The block level is sort of more amazing, which is this is not within establishment. So this says I see a large scale event. So an establishment gets a whole bunch of workers move from one place to another, but I'm not combining them with your establishment. I'm just putting them on the same block. And so even having people on the same block has this big positive effect. And this is if you get fired from like there's a mass firing event, so we shut down a whole establishment. So if you get fired from an area in which you had lots of skilled neighbors or lots of unskilled neighbors, and there, of course, there's a huge impact of being fired and not having a huge change in your skills relative to having a huge change in your skills that goes down. And so all of these seem to support the idea that this may, in fact, be a causal treatment effect of having skilled workers helping you in the long run. Okay, I'm now going to transition slightly. This is still going to be about the virtues of interaction, the virtues of integration, but it's going to be in an African context, and it's going to be in markets involving entrepreneurs, and it's going to be particularly about women. So mass urbanization proceeds quickly in places with limited rule of law and weak states. And the benefits of urban interaction are based on our ability to work collaboratively and trust one another, okay? Rule of law and urbanization are complements, which is why, Hammurabi's code is this sort of profoundly urban thing which came about thousands of years ago to try to sort of regulate urban interactions. Women, the core assumption in our paper is that women are disproportionately at risk from male expropriation. So this is both the threat of violence looms over intergender bargaining. And courts may also be biased against women. Okay, so you may lose out from sort of intergender bargaining without courts, but you may also lose from courts. And consequently, the benefits of cities can be lower for women. At least that's the hypothesis, that in fact, female traders in markets may not be able to get the same benefits that men are. Now, I should say that I wrote the model for this, okay? But this comes out of 25 years of my colleague Nava Ashraf hanging out with female entrepreneurs in Lusaka. And so it's based fundamentally on her insights from things that they've told her. And then we've got a model and some data. When you look across the world, the bulk of sort of high countries in the World Bank Enterprise Survey that have sort of high rates of female entrepreneurship tend to be in places that have both relatively good rule of law, so this is a high level of enforcing contracts, and relatively low discrimination in the family. So you need sort of both things seem to be going on to sort of beat that sort of very high level of female entrepreneurship. Across the world, in terms of GDP per capita, there appears to be an inverted U, at least in the World Bank Enterprise Survey, between female entrepreneurship and income. And so this is particularly interesting because it absolutely reverses female labor force participation, which my colleague Claudia Golden has highlighted, actually has a U shape. That actually is highest at low levels and at rich levels, but it's lowest in the middle. The opposite is true for the share of women who own enterprises, at least in this survey. Our model is that women face one of two limitations on doing businesses. One of which is they face a higher tax on their time due to family-related things. So they've got kids, they've got spouses, they've got people who are demanding stuff of them that the men are able to avoid. And this essentially limits the amount of time that they can allocate to entrepreneurial activities. The second assumption is that women face discriminatory behavior from employees. Right, so the employees are less obedient to them than they would be if they were men, or they're less respectful, or various things like that. I don't need both assumptions. I need just one, but either one will do the model that then follows. What these assumptions mean are that there's a sort of an initial tax on women entering into entrepreneurship, which deters female entrepreneurship at low levels of income, and then they gradually catch up. But when the men start transitioning into running more complex organizations, that becomes difficult either because the women still have to take care of responsibilities at home, or because these large organizations have a lot of guys and some of them are a pain in the neck, right? One of the two things occurs. And so this is the thing that illustrates our model, is that sort of as you look about the level of development, which is just the productivity of being an entrepreneur, that's sort of everywhere higher for men, but at this point, the men transition into complex organizations, and the women only do it out here because they're facing these other taxes. And so you have this ratio of female to male entrepreneurs that's first going up, but then once the men transition, then it goes down again. And this is supported by the idea that if you just compare male and female-led firms, just the male firms are just a lot bigger at low income levels, at high income levels, and the women tend to be dominated in these 0 to 10 employees. And there's other evidence that supports this, but that's the sort of fact that you should have along, that just it's much smaller employees, and that can potentially explain why you get this inverted line. Now, let me get you back to Lusaka. So this again, because I wasn't traveling to the developing world, I could do this cross-country thing, but this is the more interesting stuff, I think. So NAVA did this amazing census of urban entrepreneurs in Lusaka, where we sort of have all the entrepreneurs. And the sort of important institution that you should know is that Lusaka has these formal markets. Markets have a form of rough justice in that they have a chief. The chief can actually enforce contracts. So if you go to your chief and you say the person is behaving badly, the chief will yell at them or something, do something to enforce this contractual arrangement. Now, one fact, and this is true in the World Bank Enterprise Survey as well, if you look across industries, women are overwhelmingly in two industries. This is true in Osaka, it's true around the world. They're overwhelmingly in apparel, right, and in food manufacturing. Now, the reason for this is assuredly overdetermined in the sense that one explanation is these are just traditional skills that women have accumulated over time. A second theory, which is more compatible with the model we have, is that these industries enable women to work with other women. And so they can find partners who are other women, they find customers who are other women, they don't actually have to deal with exploitative men. This is just comparing apparel, which is our highest share. And we ran a survey where we looked at all sorts of cooperative behavior. Do you jointly buy? Do you lend? Do you advise? Do you share an order? Every one of these areas outside of apparel, men do more cooperation than women do, right? And you ask the women what's going on, and they say, look, every time I try to partner with a man, he's going to do something that's painful of some various points. So I'd rather just do it on my own or find another woman who could do it with me. That eliminates in apparel because there are enough women for other women to cooperate with. The thing that's most amazing, and you heard me talk earlier about cities as forges of human capital, and the quote above all that I'm fondest of that expresses this is Alfred Marshall's famous quote that in dense clusters, the mysteries of the trade become no mystery but are as it were in the air. Well, that seems to be true for men, but not for women in Lusaka. Okay, and you can see this. How did you learn your job? So for men, overwhelmingly, it's other entrepreneurs. Right? Whether or not they're family members, entrepreneurs in the same business, entrepreneurs in another business. For women, it's overwhelmingly formal training. So this sort of, and I think this is, to me, one of the more amazing graphs that we have is it's just totally different, the learning channels. And one is sort of peer-to-peer, and the other one is you're paying somebody to teach you something. This is Lusakan markets doing different things. So this shows the difference in trust between markets and outside markets. So these are markets in which women are less than 40%, so there still is a gap. This is markets in which women are more than 40%, and actually the women trust more than men in terms of their trusting behaviors. And this is outside of markets. Everyone is less trusting because you don't have the chief, but it's a gap. Now, Our experimental thing is we ran a trust game. Trust games have a structure. You give a first person some amount of money. The first person sends money over to an anonymous recipient. The money gets multiplied by some number, and then the trustee then has the opportunity to send money back. The way that I did something using this to measure trust in a QJE paper 25 years ago with Harvard undergraduates, and I documented that only children were much less trustworthy than non-only children, which is something that I actually found deeply offensive, as I am an only child. Luckily, this is one of those papers that you write where you're delighted that subsequent research has overturned this result. So I was actually quite happy with this. With this game, if you compare, so this is the control group. Women are sending less than men, just as they are less trusting in other things. The existence to a chief eliminates that. So if you tell the women, like if you have a problem, you can then go to the chief, and the chief can undo whatever this person did. When they get access to this, the chief undoes it. Now, interestingly, influenced by Claudia Golden and C.C. Rouse's work on judging violinists or other musicians through the advantage of blinding the judges, we thought that blinding was important. Actually, we've now worked with a whole bunch of follow-up things. Typically, actually, women want their gender to be known by the chiefs. That, in fact, the chiefs seem to have a functional role of actually protecting the weak. And in fact, it's not seen as being something that we want to be thought of as being men. We actually want the chief to understand that we are women. We actually are deserving of this benefit. So I found that fascinating. And this just shows, like, overall, the women are doing much better in terms of their financial returns from the trust game than from not the trust game. Last little bits, I'm going to race through this stuff because I'm outside of Africa again. So ask me about it in questions if you want to. First fact, this is just across the US, the relationship between population density and GDP per capita. This is upward mobility and density across metropolitan areas as coming from the Opportunity Index. So this takes people born around 1980, looks at them 35 years later, and shows that for poorer people born in cities, they're actually doing worse than poor people outside cities. My hypothesis for this was this had to do with segregation. But it's not segregation of where you live. And this comes from work that I did 30-odd years ago, looking at the sort of rise and fall of American racial segregation, showing that African-American outcomes were much worse in high segregated areas than less segregated areas, both on their own and relative to whites. But I had this hypothesis when I saw those two gaps between the upward mobility and the sort of rise in productivity, that maybe the segregation of kids was very different from the segregation of adults. That in fact, if you're an adult in a city like Chicago or New York, you go to work for a firm that's reasonably integrated, right? Where you have lots of people around you who are more skilled or have a different experience. If you're a kid, you play in a segregated neighborhood, you go to a segregated school. And so I tried to figure out if I could measure this using cell phone data. And I sort of worked with Cody Cook and Lindsay Currier. Cody is a master with this stuff. And we found that we tried to identify students by people who spent a lot of weekdays in schools. And so you can do that, but the problem is because of these safety concerns with kids, we only actually get people who are 16 and above. And so we also get all of the janitors and all the teachers and all the whatever. So we're not really getting kids cleanly versus adults. We do find more experienced segregation for our student population than for our adult population. And it's non-trivial, but it's not huge. It's not sort of night and day. The fact that was much more striking to us was just how, when we connected the kids, our identified kids, with the value of their home. So you can find out where they spend the night, and then you can sort of link them with the value, at least in Zillow, of their home, was just how different the experienced life was of people who were living in rich homes versus poor homes. And so here you can just see the time spent in primary locations. So the richer you are, the less time you spend at home. And this is a decrease of about 3% for time at home. This is an increase in log points for how far people are going. So the richer places are going to have like 40% more places than the poor places are. And this is what they're going to. So this is just controlling for the metropolitan area. This is controlling for the neighborhood in which they live. And so you can see the richer people are just going to many more places. Some of this has to do with income, right? Presumably going to retail or restaurant, that involves spending money. But this triangle here, that's parks. These parks are all free, and yet the rich kids are going to the parks and the poor kids are not. And it's true even in the same neighborhood, even with a track fixed effect. Last thing I'll give you, and this is just fun, in terms of using new tools to measure urban spaces. It turns out this amazing guy called Holly White took a lot of pictures of urban spaces in 1980, took a lot of movies of them. We have similar movies from 2010. We used AI to measure how people are using their urban spaces overall. And so we've now documented that travel speeds have gone way up over time, so people are moving around a lot more. The overall amount of lingering has gone down, especially in a participated Boston called Downtown Crossing. And people are forming less dyads and triads in the area. So there's a whole world of now using movies as well as cell phones to see how people experience urban space, transitioning to infrastructure, doing so quickly. So cities are, as an economist, as a social scientist, I never tire of making the point that the real city is made out of flesh and blood, not steel and concrete, but cities do need their infrastructure. And indeed, some of this infrastructure is crucial for actually making sure our cities are safe. And there's no sort of more critical piece of urban infrastructure than the aqueducts that bring in the water. I'm not going to give you all of this thing. The one thing that I would highlight is it's not just about the infrastructure, because New York built its aqueduct in 1842 and continued to have cholera epidemics for another 25 years because there was a last mile problem. The poor people in New York chose not to pay for the connection, and they continued to die, right? And it was only when you had the Board of Health imposed in 1866, which started imposing taxes or fines on tenement owners who didn't connect, that you saw the problem decreasing. It consequently should not have been a surprise when you built water mains in Africa that there was a last mile problem, right? There was a last mile problem that we had too, and if we'd known more history, we would have been focused on it more. In many parts of the world, there are sort of two technologies that often compete. One, a technology of the rich, the other, a technology of the poor, right? Often the right question is, when do you try to improve the quality of transportation or public health by upgrading the technology of the poor, as for example, Istanbul in the 50s and 60s did with their minibus system, and when do you just try to replace it completely with another technology? I will only make the comment on here that it is an often told joke that 40 years of transportation economics at Harvard can be boiled down to 4 words: bus good, train bad. Okay, this is two technologies as well, and this is water in Zambia. I'm going to speed through water in Zambia. We use not the variation that comes across space, but we use the random timing of breakages in our work on water. So, and typically in these high poverty years, people are missing water for about 3 days a week. So plus they don't get any water that's outside of prime days. 4 facts that come out of our paper. When the water breaks, there are more waterborne illnesses. Unsurprisingly. When the water breaks, there are more respiratory illnesses. That surprised us more, but this was pre-COVID, before we were focused on washing our hands all the time. And when the water breaks, young women spend more time doing chores and less time studying. So again, this appears to be a gendered thing. And finally, this is my favorite fact: the water company fixes the pipes of customers who pay by the liter, but not who pay by the month. And so the incentives faced by the company, like if they don't fix the customers who pay by the liter, they don't get paid. And so they fix those pipes. And so it's crucial to remember that, like, it's not just about infrastructure, it's about the incentives of the institutions that manage that infrastructure. This is the random breaking. This shows the waterborne illnesses. This shows the respiratory illnesses. This shows the young women spending more. And this shows the fact that if you have metered connections, you get fixed more. Okay, moving to the next topic. The last point on infrastructure. Maintenance. Okay, this is, for most of the last 50 years, economists have thought the whole secret to making roads faster in the world was to deal with congestion through things like congestion fees. I don't think we've changed that, but we now know from a variety of different studies, some by my colleague Gabriel Kreindler, some by Gilles Danton, co-authors, is that nighttime speeds in many developing world cities are often incredibly slow. So there's no traffic, and yet people are going incredibly slowly because the roads are so rough. Okay, and the roughness of roads, I think, becomes a topic which is also really central. This is from the work of Ram Singh, who just compares roads that are put together by public-private partnerships in India versus roads that are non-PPP roads. These are really quite comparable, because on one stretch of highway, you'll have a PPP road going for 5 kilometers and then a non-PPP road going for 5 kilometers. And the non-PPP roads are just much rougher, largely because the public procurement people just screw up on the initial procurement. Okay, they just get taken to the cleaners by the private companies that's building them. The PPP roads do not do so. I will highlight this, that like there are cases in which PPPs are helpful and cases in which they're not, right? And I'm entirely on the Deng Xiaoping program on this, right? Doesn't matter if a cat is black or white as long as it catches mice. We need to be sort of ruthlessly pragmatic about what's the right institution for the right place. Last thing I want to say, roads in the US. And so this is the quality of our highways from 2 different measures. One of which is the American Society of Civil Engineers, which gave us a B- for our highways in, I don't know what the comparable grade here, like a mediocre grade. And now for the last 30 years, they've been telling us we've had failing grade highways. The weird thing about this is we actually measure the actual roughness of our highways by sending out trucks at night, the Department of Transportation, which just measures roughness. And actually, our roads are a lot smoother than they used to be in terms of our highways. And so this is, as industry groups that are lobbying for spending on themselves often do, they're claiming that we have a huge shortfall that needs fixing. But at least in my daily commute, the problem is not the highway. It's like everything that's off the highway. It's like all of this crazy bumpiness that goes on. And the Department of Transportation doesn't measure those roads because they don't fund those roads. So we didn't have measures of this until now. And the reason why we do is that I'm blessed by many of my students, but one of my favorite students is the chief economist at Uber, who gave me a month's worth of data for the US and another, bits for Chicago, where we have road roughness from Uber. And the reason is that every Uber driver has a cell phone. The cell phones go up and down, and that data gets beamed back 5 times a second to Uber. And so Uber has data. It requires a whole bunch of Uber fixing to make this nice. But Uber has data basically on road roughness everywhere in America. And we got to play with this data. So to show you, this is what, we do a bunch of fancy stuff. We correct for driver fixed effects and time fixed effects and a whole bunch of other things. And then we measure both just the sort of overall level of bumpiness on a road segment, but also how much the bumpiness goes up with speed. So we're able to form a sort of predicted roughness everywhere in the US. And we do so fixing the speed at local roads at 20, arterials at 32, highways at 48. And this is what Chicago looks like. And so you can see, it's really bumpy in the center. It's much smoother outside the city, and we're going to use that in a second. And we do this off of thousands and thousands of rides throughout everywhere in Chicago. Now, we've done a bunch of ways of trying to convince ourselves that this is real data. For the highways, where we also have data, we sort of can compare that with the Department of Transportation data. And this is sort of what the match looks like. And then we use it for things. Now, I'm not going to explain this model. I have like -1 minute left, and it involves algebra. But I want you to get the intuition of this, okay? Which is, anytime you drive, you can make your drive smoother. How can you make your drive smoother? By slowing down. Slowing down is essentially paying with time, okay, to get a smoother drive. And so the logic of economics tells you you can sort of use how much people slow down to get a sense of how much people dislike bumpy roads, okay? And so that's what we do. And this is the algebra that goes with it. And, and so we sort of basically integrate up the extent to which speeds change with roughness. And then we estimate the relationships between speeds with roughness with a bunch of sort of natural experiments. The one that I like best is just the border discontinuities. So you can take a narrow range of road. Some of it's in Evanston, some of it's in Chicago. Like, the roads get a lot smoother when you leave Chicago, and the speeds go a lot up. Go up a lot. And so you can just use that to get at the speed roughness relationship. And so these are our estimates. We feed that into the model, and the magic happens. And this is kind of what we estimate the roughness adds. So median roughness gives an extra cost of 31 cents a mile. That's over about 80 cents is our baseline calculation. One standard deviation higher is 23 cents a mile. There's sort of a range of costs. It gets slightly larger than that using other natural experiments we have, like road resurfacing. But this is a sort of order of magnitude. We then estimate how roads are different in different parts of America. So continuing with the sort of segregation theme, if you go from 100% white to 100% African-American neighborhood, that's associated with $456 per year due to an additional road roughness cost. Now, to be clear, this is just the road cost to the driver. There actually may be benefits from roughness, which is people slow down and they're less likely to hit other people. So this is just, but for the drivers, it's $456. We're not claiming that this is sort of like causal or anything. We're just making a statement that this is what the roads are like in different places. The bulk of it overwhelmingly is across, not within towns. So it's not that the whiter parts of Chicago are smoother. It's that whites live in Evanston and African Americans live in Chicago, and they have much worse roads in Chicago. There's within-town heterogeneity, and typically, and you can just see this in this, the bigger the town, the flatter the race and income gradients are. Okay, in part because rich people live in the urban core. And so this is New York. Like, the worst roads in New York are like Brooklyn Heights and Tribeca. Like, billionaires live in Tribeca, right? But the roads are the bumpiest in the city, in part because they're cobbled by design, in part because this is where the trucks go most. Chicago, one part of the African-American center, the south side, which is actually where I learned to drive, those are actually pretty smooth roads. The west side, which is the center of sort of industrial Chicago, they're terrible roads. This just says, road expenditure does not explain between town heterogeneity. And this is my last fact on this, and then I have 2 slides left. My last fact is, in 8 out of the 11 cities where we have data on both roughness and road repaving, there is no correlation between roughness and the probability of being repaved. Let me repeat that. In 8 out of the 11 cities where we have data, there is no correlation between road roughness and the probability of subsequent repaving in the next 8 months, right? We are not repaving the rougher roads any more than we are repaving the smoothest roads in the city. And so my simple recipe for making American infrastructure better is not to spend more or do anything that's complicated. Just repave the broken roads before you repave the unbroken roads, okay? And I will just end with this. I often think, and when we think about sort of transforming African cities, and I will come back to this, right, the theme, like cities are really best thought of as a three-legged stool, a triad, if you will, where one part of it is this magic of economic and human interactions, the fact that we learn from each other. And it's captured by the old city of Jerusalem, where there's buying and there's selling and there's learning and there's laughing and there's all these things that we love about being in an urban space with other people. One third of it is the demons that come with density. The contagious disease, the high housing costs, the crime, the various bad things that happen when human beings are close to one another. The fact that if two people are close enough to exchange a smile, they're also close enough to exchange a virus, right? And then the third is the physical city, right? Which is, also important. And so when we think about transforming African cities, I think a lot of it is we just need to make sure that we're doing the right things we need to battle the demons of density and making sure that we are both enabling the private sector to deliver its own infrastructure, but also ensuring that the public sector does a better job of managing the public spaces than America's cities seem to be doing with their road repaving. So I will end there. Thank you very, very much. You want to? Yes, it's time for Q&A.
Yes. Do you want to?
I can do it. I can do it, Peter. I can think. Questions, and I will cold call if I'm not getting any. Anyone have a thought or an idea or? Peter, please.
So I think I said this to you before. You said railways bad, buses good. I attended a presentation on Friday where they said railways good for South Africa. Could you answer this for us?
Well, first of all, even the four words needs to be prefaced in one way, which is, in fact, rails can be very good for moving stuff. They're just not great for moving people, right? And indeed, part of the whole genius of Fred Kahn when he was, reforming America's transportation regulation in the 1970s is he enabled America's railroads to get out of the people-moving business into the business of moving goods, which they tend to be quite efficient at. Secondly, there are levels of density at which rail can make sense. Think Hong Kong. Okay, and there are companies like the Hong Kong train outfit that actually can fund themselves. Their trains don't pay for themselves with the fares. They pay for themselves by building high rises on top of the train stations, and they make back enough in the real estate to offset the cost of the trains. Right. This is in a sort of high dense, highly wealthy place. It is almost impossible to ever make trains make sense in the US, in part because all of our train infrastructure costs 4 times as much as any other country. So we seem to be almost as bad at building trains as we are in repaving roads. But it's just very, very hard to get them to make sense. So I will not comment on extending the Gautrain's reach right now. I have not done cost-benefit analysis on it, but I would say that, cost-benefit analysis needs to be done. And it tends to be very hard to get these things to actually make sense. But I will not make any comments about this particular infrastructure on this. And I think there's almost no way. So I do have a student, Oluchi Mabuno, who I think is presenting her paper in the next couple of days, who worked on the private minibuses in Johannesburg. And I think this is an amazing market and a fascinating market. But there's almost no way that you could convince me that it's not worthwhile thinking about how the minibus market can be improved in various ways, and whether or not this involves safety or regularity or something like that. I'm not going to suggest what I think those ways are, but I think there is one downside of focusing on the Gautrain, right? Because it's sort of an engineering problem, and you kind of understand it's not messy and it doesn't involve violence and it doesn't involve a lot of other things, is that we don't focus on the kind of transportation that ordinary people use more of the time. And I think that's a mistake. I think figuring out how to get the minibus system to be more functional, safer, is likely to be a relatively high return, lower cost activity relative to focusing on the Gautrain. But again, I haven't done the cost benefit analysis. I'm not going to make any statements on this. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so you mentioned something about so you briefly mentioned something about minimizing densification, and I'm an urban planning student, and one of the concepts that we try to learn about is to kind of mitigate the urbanization problem that considers to densify more to kind of cater for the growing population. But I just want to see, like in African cities, what is the practical realization of it? Is it even possible in African cities? And what are some of the economic implications of it in just the context of African cities?
It's a great question. So some parts of density are easy to talk about, right? Which is when we're talking about the sort of formal housing in the world, right? I mean, I tend to think almost everywhere housing, new construction is overregulated, right? And this is not, this has been a topic that I've worked on for the last 25 years. It's been focused above all in the U.S., but I think the U.S. has done a tremendous harm to itself by just allowing localities to overregulate the construction of new housing, which means it's much harder to sort of move to places that are more productive. It's much harder for younger people to sort of buy and find a brighter future. And so that feels like a no-brainer to me. We want to have fewer rules that make it difficult to add density in these areas. I think this is also true in most of the formal areas in the developing world as well. So like Mumbai has labored under a floor area requirement of 1.25, which means they've all had to be less than 1.25 floors on average for most of the last 46 years. Some of that has been reduced lately. I think that's madness. I mean, this came from copying the British Town and Country Planning Act, and which I don't think I'm on that side either, but whatever you think is right for Sussex is not right for Mumbai, okay? And it's just sort of madness. Now, the hard part about Africa, right, is what do you do about the informal settlements where you don't have law to begin with, right? And so that's really difficult. And I'm not sure I know the right answer to it, but I know that it's a question which I really hope that you're thinking about because it feels like it's a really important one. The one thing that I'm certain that I would do is I would be rethinking the rules that are so-called Euclidean zoning, which is the stuff that keeps workplaces out of residences. Right, and so that feels like that's a real unfortunate limit on South Africa's entrepreneurship that I would probably think is a bad idea. Again, think about the cost-benefit analysis on all of it. But Euclidean zoning came in the 1920s, and it made sense when the primary form of work was like factories belching smoke, or tanneries polluting the neighborhood, or a great abattoir that was belching filth out. But it doesn't make sense to keep out. Why would you want to keep an insurance giant out of your neighborhood? They're not doing anything bad, right? It's actually a useful thing to have workplaces around, and especially sort of post-COVID. The cities in the US that have the most difficulty coming back are the cities that have these vast islands of workplaces that have no residences interspersed. And so the people there, of course, have the worst commutes, and they're the least functional, and they've had the hardest part getting back, whereas the places in which workplaces and residences are interspersed are just lots more desirable. So again, good luck with the townships. I'm there if you come up with something, but I don't know exactly how to fix it, but I do know it's important, and I do know it's really interesting. And again, just the point about regulation is this is a common theme of mine. Let me take us back to the second slide, where I said urban governments need to focus on the right tasks. The right task is rarely over-regulating entrepreneurship or over-regulating housing or over-regulating lots of things, right? The right thing is figuring out how am I going to deliver more skills to poor kids? How am I going to make sure that kids get to work home in safety? And unfortunately, there's sort of often a sense in which we're led towards unfortunate forms of public action because maybe they're easier to imagine rather than the more important ones, which are messier and more difficult, but eminently worth fighting for. Okay, yes, sir.
Weird. Sorry, this is a little bit of a parochial question, but I really think I wouldn't be upset if I didn't get to ask you. So I know you know South Africa a little bit. A big topic of concern amongst South Africans is the decline in the quality of local government in Johannesburg and and in many other cities, and the Cape Town appears to be the only municipality that's sort of doing a reasonable job of providing local government services. And Johannesburg's experienced a lot of housing price declines as well, and Cape Town's become a lot more expensive. I want to ask, just if you had to speculate, theme of this question and your earlier work, is Detroit the future of Johannesburg, and is San Francisco the future of Cape Town?
Well, Cape Town is awfully nice. And if you thought your job was to attract and train smart people and then let them go, it's a Cape Town model. And that's a model that is it's a Stellenbosch model too. I mean, this is a pretty amazing place as well. I assume we're talking about the Cape Town area, so I think that's right. And I think the thing that you worry about, the thing that makes this sort of bad part of San Francisco is because it's incredibly difficult to build there. And so you want to make sure that Cape Town is making it easy enough to build so that, the high-end talent is able to afford stuff without putting the pressure on poor areas, which is the cause of the San Francisco pain. Now, I think Johannesburg is a great city. I think it is a city that is challenged. And I'm, I'm not going to make any predictions for Johannesburg. I do think that there are, one of my mantras in city government is that capacity is often trumps policy. Meaning, if you walk into a mayor's office and you've got 47 brilliant ideas, but she's got, 3 people who will do anything that she tells them to do, right? Those ideas aren't going to do them any good. Now, one of the ways in which capacity often gets delivered to local governments is that the business community steps in. And so, for example, one of my favorite modern examples of this is something called the Columbus Partnership, which for at least 25 years has delivered an enormous amount of external support for the city of Columbus. The city of Columbus is still in charge. It's not like you're duplicating it, but if they have to apply for a federal grant or if they have to do something, Columbus Partnership will do that work for them. Right? And I have been pushing that model among the business community of Johannesburg since at least 2019, that there needs to be sort of more external help in terms of being committed to the city and all of the city, not just a sort of narrow range of interests. I haven't had much success. I tried again on Tuesday. I will continue to try to do this, but it's, and it's not particularly Columbus, right? Boston had something called the Vault. There are, throughout America, there are areas in which sort of local businesses have taken on the responsibility of trying to make things somewhat better in their area. And I think Johannesburg could use some help like that. I think that's sort of, but I don't think that I don't think that anything is doomed to be Detroit. I mean, Africa's cities are going to continue to grow, but Johannesburg faces challenges. But I think it can be one of the world's great cities, and I think it should be that as well. Okay, I think I'm done, Dieter. Is there I think, well, actually, why am I looking at Dieter? Okay, so we got one more question. Go ahead.
Thank you very much for your presentation. And I'm from Erin from the Center for Sustainability Transitions, which should give you an indication of where my question is going to go. I think transforming African cities is a big ask. And so my first thought when I heard your topic was to try and understand what's generalizable about African cities across the continent when we understand the context also entirely different. So I landed on informality, and I was trying to understand what do you think the role of informality is when we understand the level of infrastructure development that we need across the continent, when we understand project limitations that we have, so we have to pursue low carbon development. We understand that about 60% of this infrastructure still needs to be built. So I was just wondering, when you think of resilience of our African cities, when you think of the capacity that exists to build this sort of infrastructure, I was just wondering what your thoughts on informality is, particularly with your background. I think in your bio it said something about innovation. So I was just wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
I mean, I think it's a great question. I think as my suggestions on regulation earlier suggested, I like entrepreneurship, right? And I like entrepreneurship whether it's formal, informal. And I think typically what we call informality is a result of regulations that have made it impossible for poor people to actually comply with them. And that's I mean, you can fight informality if you want, but the only fighting that seems fair to me is both make those regulations less onerous and provide more skills so they're more willing to pay for those regulations, not to think that you want to punish people for being entrepreneurs. That feels crazy to me. That being said, I mean, the sort of infrastructure side is inevitably going to be formal by and large, but I think as my suggestions on the minibus network suggest, like there should be a soft transition, right? You can get them sort of into the system without expecting yourself immediately to have like Denmark, right? So being more tolerant of things that are sort of the mixed gray area feels like the right path to getting something, which is, an improvement, but not a 100% jump to sort of some expectation that's not going to happen. But I do want to relate to the environment. And there is a reason why I actually haven't said anything about climate change during this entire thing. And there's a reason for that. One of which is, so first of all, I wrote a paper called The Greenness of Cities maybe 15 years ago, which made the point with US data that dense living was typically associated with significantly lower carbon emissions. And it also made the point that the California environmentalists who were stopping building in California were actually making carbon emissions worse, because in fact, California is naturally low carbon. And when you don't build in California, you build in Texas, you build outside of Oklahoma City, you build in much higher density areas. So once again, the sort of well-meaning, like it is a basic fact in life that abundance is so often created by people who you don't think of as being sort of morally great. And yet the people who you find morally deeply admirable are the architects of scarcity, right? And it's a sort of deep fact about the world. But in terms of Africa, there are two other reasons, which is why I didn't bring it up. One of which is on the mitigation side. on reducing carbon emissions. I'm not in a place where I want to ask Africa for anything on this. I think like we created this problem, we meaning the wealthy world, like it's our job to fix this, not expecting Africa to solve it. Now, despite that, on adaptation, right? You're stuck with it. Like that's not like, and you know, guys are going to die whether of floods or of heat. And the reason why I didn't say about it, I don't know what the answer is. I know a lot of things about cities, but I actually don't know how to climate-proof the cities of the global south. And it is one of when I stopped being department chair, I made my list of my 5 things that I wanted to do with the rest of my life, and it was one of those 5 things. But like, invite me back in a decade. Hopefully, I'll have something to say on that. So, thank you for your question, and thank you very much for this for being here.
Thank you very much, Ed. There was a lot of food for thought there. Thank you for giving us very much more to think about, and I think we actually need a lot more time to think about all this. I think we should read all your books and your papers. I'd like to thank everybody for being here this evening. I'd like to thank Remgrove for supporting us, for supporting this event and for sponsoring this event. I'd like to, in their absence, the Amanda Visser and the family for also continuing their association with this event, and especially to Ed and also to your family who's here, Nancy, Nicholas, Elizabeth, thank you for coming, and we hope you really enjoy the rest of your time in South Africa, and we do hope you come back, and with those solutions. We would just like to give us a small token of our appreciation. And we hope that you will remember Stellenbosch. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
And thank you to everybody who's attended. We trust you'll have safe travels and a good evening. Thank you very much.